Okay, let's go ahead and get this kicked off. So thank you everybody for joining us today for the Spectrum and Users, What You Need to Know About the Path to Fixed LTE webinar presented by Telrad Networks. My name is Doria Iran of Eye Opening Marketing, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. We would like to hear from you today, so ask questions and share comments. Use the question and answer panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player to share at any time during the webinar. We will have a couple of poll questions during the webinar. Those will pop up right on your screen. We'll give you a few seconds to answer each, and then we'll share the results. We'll also have time for questions at the end. Today's presenter is Tom Gruba, VP of Telrad Marketing. He has over 30 years of experience in telecommunications in various capacities. Also presenting today is Steve Coran of the firm Lerman Center. Steve is the chairman of the firm's broadband practice group and serves on its management committee. His practice focuses on the representation of broadband providers and equipment and technology companies, serving their policy, compliance, and licensing needs. He actively represents a trade association before the FCC, Congress, and other federal agencies. Also joining us today is Nick Dewar, Vice President of Systems Engineering and Business Development for Telrad Networks. While not presenting today, he has a wealth of LTE knowledge and will help answer any product or technical questions that arise. We're proud to have them all with us today. So without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Tom.
Thanks very much, Dory. Welcome, everyone. Today we've got a packed agenda, and with a special guest of Steve Coran, we're going to talk in detail about what's happening in 2.5 and what's happening with 3.65, which are very important topics. So as we go through on the agenda here, what's changing in the market, why managed spectrum is essential to future success, the latest with those two frequencies, as I said, and then answering the question on the affordability of LTE in low density markets, which the more people I talk to, the more I find out people have concerns with that. The game changers that we've got going on are what's happening with users, always one of my favorite topics. Who's been using unlicensed spectrum? So the mobile operators a few years ago started going after it in 5 gigahertz, just because the amount of capacity that they need required them to rethink their strategy in terms of only using licensed spectrum. We'll cover CBRS in detail. One of the other key components here is LTE, which has been a standard since 2007, has now been successfully used in the fixed wireless market for over 3 years. So you've got the same standards that are driving the capacity forward in the fixed wireless market. And then 5G, people ask us about 5G. What is it you need to know? So we're going to cover that. So I'm going to do one of my favorite pieces, which is what's happening with users. But first, we have one of 3 polls today. Your polls help guide the conversation. So please, Dory will take you through the poll and we'll give you the results, and it'll help us a lot.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and launch that first poll right now. It's where are you in the process of evaluating fixed LTE for your network? Determining the business case, investigating LTE technology, evaluating LTE vendors, looking to try it, or some other?
That's great. We've got 58% of you, 63% of you that have voted. So thank you. Keep those votes coming.
Okay, we'll give that a few more seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. So here are the results. Determining the business case is at 31%. We also have 31% for investigating LTE technology, 19% for evaluating LTE vendors, and 19% are other. 0% for looking to try it.
Yeah, I hope the 19% tell us through the chat what they're interested in hearing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what's happening with the users. You know that the people at home, they're doing more and more streaming. And you know that because the number of people that are cutting the cable cord has risen dramatically between 2010 and 2016. And it's gone from 4.5% to 22%. And that 22% represents almost 27 million households, which is a very significant number. At the same time, you look at the type of video, right? We talk about HD, but then you talk about 4K video, and the amount of capacity that you need to send and receive 4K video comes out to be somewhere between 15 to 25 megabits per stream. Amazon and Netflix provided those numbers, and it's about 4K, but that's the variance you see even today with experts like those video folks. And of course, one of the things that's near and dear to our heart is understanding who has access to broadband at significant speeds, and 21% of census blocks still do not have access to 25 megabits per second. So on the one hand, you've got what people are doing and enjoying is video, and then you look and you've got a large portion of the population that still doesn't have access. So there's opportunity and there's a need. Now on the right side of the screen, the other thing that's happening and become very common is it used to be one stream per house, but now it's multiple streams per house. And when that happens, you're looking at having multiple users in a home consuming more capacity than you as an operator probably planned on in your business case. So that's one problem. The second problem are the words that I put down below the image, which is people are treating streaming like cable TV. And there's stories of people that couldn't, the operators that could not figure out how any one home could consume that many bits. And they realized that the people were running multiple TVs and streaming TV and streaming shows just like they do with cable. So a couple of those things to make you aware of that's changing the market if you do not know. Now the impact to you as an operator is as below. So if you look at line one, if you look at a package that say, and I get a 15 meg package, so it's 15 megabits per second. The average usage per home from our engineering department, they say is 2.5 megabits per second. So from a sector capacity, from an LTE sector capacity, and LTE sector capacity is easy to calculate. For a 20 megahertz channel that you see there, you get 5.5 bits per hertz. So that 20 take it times 5 to make the math easy, you get 100 megabits. So the sector capacity is 40 homes for that particular area. And if your subscription price is $50 a month, the cost of your investment per home is 2.5%. But look at it, even if you have a higher price package and you have 25 megabits and getting $75 a month, if that home gets to 3 streams or more, you're looking at the amount of capacity that they're consuming and you're not increasing your revenues on a monthly basis. So they're using more and they're paying you the same amount of money, which is a recipe for disaster. So two things need to occur. Number one, educating users about how they're using streaming and what they're actually paying for. And the second is how to continually increase the capacity of your system. So problem number one, will users pay more? So when I talk to people and say, you know what, I've been in the business a long time, I have a 15 meg service, a friend of mine has 25 meg, another friend has 192. And I said, so what's the difference between us? What can you do with 192 meg that I can't do with 15 or 25? And there's never a good answer for it. If you look at what people value, so people don't, the point of that is they don't understand what they're getting, what 25 meg means or what 15 megs. They're just emphasizing more is better. And that's not typically the case, especially if you use cloud-based applications like I'm doing, use Outlook 365. And I notice delays and latencies more there using Word and some of the other programs. And I rarely have a problem when I'm streaming Netflix because it's buffered. Now, what users do understand is they want to stream 3 streams or 2 streams or streams plus music. So they don't understand best effort, but they do understand that they want to get their video. And so if you look at this slide, it's really about educating users and understanding what do they want to support, the SD, HD, 4K, and how many of them do they want to support. From there, you can potentially change your pricing structure and your offerings to, number one, compete with cable, because you get out of the my 100 megabits is better than your 100 megabits. And you can get into, well, this is what you want, this is what you need. So if you want to stream 2 4K streams, here's the package that your company offers and here's the price point for it. So hopefully that will help at least start the conversation with what needs to happen with users. The second problem is how do you quickly and flexibly increase network capacity to keep up with that rising demand? It's the second problem that we talk about. What are the right tools to put in place? So as you're making a determination on LTE, as you're making a determination on a vendor, a few of the things that you want to look for your product selection is as follows. You want to buy equipment that's software upgradable. You'll hear them termed software-defined radio. That gives you the capability from a remote location, at your network operations center, for example, to be able to download new software that has increased capacity, features, and functions right to the radio without a truck roll. Number two is you want to look at the vendor that you're choosing and find out what the long-term roadmap is for capacity and how much of that can be put on an existing platform. So with Telrad, we use a 4x4 radio, and that 4x4 radio for flexibility, we'll license it such that you can start with a 2x2 radio, but as your needs rise, you can add software licensing and software utilizing the 4x4 aspects of the radio, not have to climb the tower and replace the radio, and you can download the software over the air. A second very important component is, if I talk about having a wideband radio, that's how much of the spectrum can I service at any one point in time. So for example, Telrad radio current platform is 40 megahertz. So if I take 40 megahertz times that 5.5 bits per hertz that we talked about, 40 times 5, 200 megabits is what a Telrad radio can support maximum per sector with the tools that we're talking about for the software carrier aggregation and things of that nature. The second thing that you want to make sure you're good, especially with 365 and 3.5 CBRS bands being discussed, is you want a radio that you can tune anywhere across the band. So for those of you that are business people, what that means is if you've got into your car, you can tune your FM dial from one end to the other. You can cover the entire band. No one would actually buy a radio that only covers part of that band. So in RF, we don't get the choice to tune across the entire band because they're too large, but you want as much as possible. And a Telrad radio tunes across about 300 megahertz of spectrum. So look at where you're going and understand how that product choice is going to impact your requirements, not just today, but also in the future. The next item here for keeping up with demand is selecting the right spectrum to reduce interference problems. And by doing so, you maximize the capacity of your network. Most of you that have operated networks know that interference just robs capacity from the system, and it's unlicensed bands that suffer from that more than licensed bands. So the one thing with a licensed band that we're very cognizant of, and we make sure that we coach our operators about, is self-interference and how to maximize the capacity and avoid self-interference. The final is, if you plan for additional spectrum and frequency, then you look at your growth plans and understand how much spectrum am I going to need, how much can I get access to, and what will that give me in terms of capacity. So those are the key mechanisms for keeping up with demand. If I look at our features specific to Telrad equipment, one of the 3GPP standard features is called carrier aggregation. It allows us to concatenate two different channels, two chunks of spectrum, and make it look like one. And the reason you want to do that is if you take two 10 megahertz pieces of spectrum, it allows them to make it look like a 20, and 20 times 5 bits per hertz is 100 megabits per second. Okay, so it is a software feature, so we can do it over the air, and away you go. The next feature is multi-user MIMO, which increases the spectral efficiency. So that 5 bits per hertz I talked about goes to 10 bits per hertz. This is a theoretical limit, so understand that you're never going to get a perfect doubling, but at least this is how it's designed from a theoretical standpoint. You don't increase your rate, so you don't go from 200 megabits to 400 megabits. What you do is you end up with two 200 megabit streams. So it's using one pair of antennas to transmit 200 megabits out of one and 200 megabits out of the other set of antennas. Dual sector is a great way to use one radio. Yes.
Does the Telrad radio support 60 megahertz IBW?
Nick, I'm glad you're on.
Yeah, actually, the radio head supports 3.4 to 3.7. Of course, it would be certified even under CBRS only for the 3550 to 3700. That said, you can aggregate channels anywhere within that the supported bandwidth. So it actually supports beyond 60 megahertz IBW. It can support taking taking the regulatory side out of the picture. It could support 290 megahertz of IBW. That said, because of the regulatory requirements, it would have to be within the top 150 megahertz or the Part 96 component of CBRS band, 3550 to 3700.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, Dory?
Nope, that was it for right now.
Okay. So for those of you looking at LTE and saying, is it a cost-effective solution? Dual sector is a great feature. And what it allows you to do is take a 4x4 radio, so 4 transmit, 4 receive radio, and point it in 2 directions as two 2x2 radios. So the dual sector allows you to cover twice the area that you otherwise would with a radio. So you can set those sectors up, and that main benefit is that it's going to allow you to cost effectively serve their user population, especially if you're entering a new market, especially if you're trying to understand a market survey. Will the adoption and take-up rate be what you expect it to be? So the dual sector is a great way to make effective use of your CapEx, and that radio can be repurposed once you end up with the capacity and the demand from users, that you can now turn it into a 4x4 radio, add another radio to the tower, add 1 or more radios to the tower, and continually add capacity to your site. So today's challenge with Spectrum. So more and more companies are requiring Spectrum. When I first started out, the people that use Spectrum were radio, TV, ham radio operators in the military. Now you have everybody that's requiring it because so many devices are wireless, whether it's in your home, IoT, wireless, being mobile, fixed wireless, like we're doing. And so there's so much demand and there's not enough spectrum. So the government and universities are looking for creative ways to maximize the effective use of what spectrum's available. The 365 band, 3.5 band CBRS band is known as the innovation band. We'll talk more about that, but it enables more people to have access to spectrum. So that's one point. The second point is, if I look at unlicensed spectrum, the challenge is that the noise floor rises. And if you think about noise floor, a simple example is if you go to a party and you're the first person at the party and there's 2 of you there, you can talk across the room, no problem. I can probably talk as fast as I'm talking now. But as that party fills up, you've got to be closer and closer to the other person, and you have to talk very slowly. In fact, sometimes you have to get down to just a word or two so that you can make yourself heard. What this does is reduces the size of your serving area, and it reduces your capacity. So that is a huge challenge with unlicensed bands. That's not to say don't use unlicensed bands. It's just understand what the risks are of why you want a strategy that is both licensed plus unlicensed in terms of use, and only you understand what is happening to spectrum in your location. So if you're in an area where you're getting a lot of build out, you could expect the interference floor to rise. If you're in areas that is a farming community, always will be 10 farmhouses per square mile, then things will be pretty much standard and won't change a lot.
We have another follow-up technical question.
Great.
Will power be shared from radio for 2 sectors, thus power per sector will be 3 dB lower?
The power will be based on EIRP requirements. So it's 30 dBm output power per port, and that's regardless of the configuration. So that's the max power that can be configured. That said, you would, in essence, be regulated or limited by the max EIRP based on the band.
And so, Nick, if I look at the question, it says, so we do not drop 3 dB, correct?
That's correct. The output power per port can be turned up to 30 dBm, and that is regardless of the configuration.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you very much for that question. That would logically be what people would think. So we'll have to incorporate that into future presentations. The unlicensed spectrum that we talked about is not only driven by population and the number of operators and people using unlicensed spectrum for inside in building and house, but it's also being driven by the mobile operators. You'll hear these terms: LTE-U, that's LTE unlicensed; LTE-LAA, that's license assisted access. All of these are the mobile operators using 5 gigahertz to deliver payload to users, because now they're on unlimited plans, and there's just always a more challenging environment in a mobile environment to deliver enough capacity. And so therefore they're using every means possible. So the result is that the noise floor rises, it reduces your capacity, which injects risk into your business model. And that's the real crux of it. If you look at what people think, well, not rural, right? Well, the examples of rural could be the 10 farmhouses per square mile, or it could be, I grew up in rural Illinois, as they say, but the town was 35,000, which are markets to Sprint, Verizon, and AT&T. So understanding where you are. Now, if you look at some of the radios out there, people are talking about how do I get more capacity? So you'll hear about 256 QAM, you hear about other great technical innovations, but in an unlicensed band, that doesn't mean you'll get to use 256 QAM, for example, if your noise floor is such that the SINAR doesn't allow you to get this 256 QAM. So from a business perspective, you're buying an expensive radio that can't deliver what you bought it for. I liken it to trying to drive a car, up a mountain. You may start out in 5th gear when it's very nice and flat, but you're going to downshift along the way to get all the way to 1st gear. A radio works the same way. The modulation scheme downshifts to be able to keep a connection up, deliver bits, but it's not going to deliver the maximum amount of bits. So licensed spectrum is becoming a business imperative. A couple of reasons. Number one is the capacity, as we discussed, but number two, you look at business customers that you may have or you're pursuing who want a service level agreement. And if you want to sleep at night, you're going to sleep a lot better if you're using 2.5 or 3.65 or the soon to be CBRS band. The third point I like to make on this slide is for all of you out there that are investigating what to do, start that now. You don't want to be looking and waiting for something and then start, because other people will be ahead of you. So look at what's available in your area. If you need help, contact us at Telrad. We have companies that we know like Select Spectrum that can help investigate 2.5 in your area. And then we're going to talk about 3.65 here and the CBRS band because we hear people talking about waiting, and there's really no reason to wait. There's some things you have to understand about what it involves if you wait, but there is, again, no reason to wait. So I think this is a great slide to turn it over to Steve. And what I told Steve before you all got on the phone was, Steve, take your time. We've got two very important topics where we've got some new information, 2.5 being one of them, and then 3 CBRS band being the other one. So the floor is yours, and take as much time, and Dory, take the questions in as they come.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Dory. Always look forward to these webinars and having the opportunity to inform folks on some developments, and in this case, some very new and ongoing developments in the spectrum space. So let's talk first about the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. This is shared by 2 services. One is the Broadband Radio Service, BRS, and the other is the Educational Broadband Service, or EBS. EBS is licensed only to nonprofit educational institutions engaged in education, and the spectrum is to be used in support of that mission. And under current FCC rules, up to 95% of that spectrum can be leased for commercial purposes for 30-year terms. Sprint has the lion's share of the spectrum. Not sure the exact amount, but I would guess about 80% of the spectrum is either directly licensed to or leased to Sprint. You're talking about 190 megahertz, give or take, in this band, so it's quite a big chunk of good propagating spectrum. The remaining 20% is either unleased or it is leased to small wireless ISPs, and we've been fortunate enough to work with a number of folks to help them acquire 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. So as it says on the slides here, this is protected spectrum. Under current rules, each license, at least in the EBS space, has a site-based protection that runs 35 miles out from a center point. The BRS, the commercial licenses, are often more geography-based. This allows you to offer service level agreements to business customers with confidence. It also offers, in the form of leases, kind of a pay-as-you-go model. So on a 30-year lease, you may only have to put a portion of that money up front, and the rest of it is financeable. So at long last, the FCC looks like it's going to be opening a proceeding to take a look at these rules. We haven't seen any new licenses except under waiver since 1995. That's quite a long time. And the FCC now seems poised to want to adopt a notice of proposed rulemaking, which we expect that they will do a week from today at its May 10th meeting. Once that is published in the Federal Register, comments will be due 30 days thereafter and 60 days for any reply comments. So here's what the FCC is proposing to do in kind of two different categories. The first is, what do we do with existing licenses? What you have is, with these 35-mile circles, is some places they overlap, and in some places there are gaps between them. So the FCC is saying, well, what if we expanded these existing geographic service areas, these 35-mile GSAs as they're called, out to either the census tract boundary that's immediately just outside of that circle, or even larger area would be out to the county border. How should we split where we have, kind of two parties sharing either a census tract or a county? And the FCC is also proposing for these existing licensees to eliminate the educational eligibility rules and essentially allow these licensees to sell their licenses to commercial operators. They could sell to other licensees, which they can anyway. They're proposing to get rid of the 30-year limit on leases. So then the next question is, what do we do about places, otherwise called white spaces, where we don't have any licenses on a given channel? You have 4 channel groups, A, B, C, D, and G, each with 22.5 megahertz, but you don't have them everywhere because they were licensed on a site-based basis many years ago, and especially in a lot of the flyover states out west and in the Midwest, you may not have licenses on all 5 channels. You may not have them on any channels. So the FCC wants to encourage local educational participation and has come up with what they refer to as priority windows. And the first of these windows would allow existing licensees to edge out to the county border. The second would be for tribal areas. And the third would be for new local educators to have an opportunity to apply. So one question that comes up with these filing windows is there's an auction requirement. So with an auction requirement, that obviously may not be suitable for instances where you have public institutions using public money to bid against each other. So one of the proposals is to allow some sort of a settlement period. So if my school and Tom's school bid on in the same window and they somehow overlap, we'd have an opportunity to enter into a channel sharing arrangement or a geography sharing arrangement or some sort of thing that the FCC will invite comment on. So what if we still have white areas left over after this process is over? Well, then the FCC would say anybody would be eligible to apply for the spectrum. I should also mention that for any educator that is successful in obtaining a license through either a local priority window, either through expansion or being in a tribal area or being a new educational institution, the FCC wants to preserve the educational requirements, which is this 5% spectrum set aside and a requirement that the channels be available 20 hours per channel per week for educational programming. So this is all going to be adopted at the at the FCC's open meeting on the 10th of May. So let me move on to the 3.5 band. This is occupying a fair amount of bandwidth here in Washington, D.C. as well. The FCC adopted rules in 2015 to open up an additional 100 megahertz between 3.55 to 3.65, which is adjacent to the 3.65 to 3.7 band that has been commercially available since 2008. And so right now, these licenses would be awarded in 10 megahertz chunks for up to 70 megahertz of that new 100 megahertz. The remaining 30 megahertz plus the 50 megahertz that exists between 3.65 to 3.7 would be available on a general authorized access basis, which means there's a registration requirement with a spectrum access system that would allow you to operate in that band without interference protection that you would get from a license. The licenses would be acquired at auction. We're probably a couple of years away from that. And those rules for priority access licenses, otherwise known as PALs, are under review at the FCC right now. And some of the changes would involve increasing the size of the license area from census tract, there are 74,000 of those, to something larger. Also extending the term from 3 years out to 7 or 10 years, and also maybe incorporating a renewal expectancy. So that process is pretty fluid and ongoing. The mobile community would prefer licenses for larger areas that would be essentially permanent through a 10-year plus a renewal requirement. A lot of other folks would prefer shorter term licenses for smaller areas. So again, that's a very hot topic that we're spending a lot of time here on in Washington. And then finally, there is the band between 3.7 and 4.2 that is currently in front of the FCC, and we expect the FCC to adopt a notice of proposed rulemaking at either its June or its July open meeting. That will look at opening up that 500 megahertz for mobility or for fixed or for some sort of shared basis with existing C-band satellites, or potentially clearing part of that band so you can create a nationwide area that would be suitable for 5G mobile operations. So, and then finally, NTIA, which is part of the Department of Commerce, is looking at 3.450 to 3.55, so another 100 megahertz of spectrum, potentially for commercial purposes. Right now, it's allocated only for federal government uses, but there's the potential for allowing that to be available for commercial wireless purposes. So that's kind of a quick review of all of the, I guess what we could loosely call mid-band spectrum here in the U.S.
We've got a couple questions, Chris. Steve. We have existing 3.65 license that expires this year. Will we be able to renew it?
So the answer is that existing licenses can be renewed to the end of a transition period, which is April 16th, 2020. After that, your Part 90 license will become general authorized access under new Part 96. It should be business as usual because there won't be any priority access licenses in that 50 megahertz to bump you off. So that's the state of play with respect to existing licenses. Good question.
Okay, another question. Who currently owns 3.65 to 3.7 from operators?
Well, a lot of wireless internet service providers, colleges, oil and gas companies hold those licenses right now. And they are available to acquire if you want what I would call a short-term license, which is less than 2 years. In the secondary market, you may have to hunt around a little bit, but there are folks who can help you locate and acquire those licenses so that you can begin to deploy gear in 3.65 that would be software defined and upgradable to operate across the entire 150 megahertz once we go live in the Citizens Broadband Radio service.
And Steve, I want to come back to a point you made just to make sure we're clear, because I've gotten a question on this recently. I've been told by a lot of customers or prospects that they're waiting for CBRS. And right now, as a business owner, you look at it and you got to say, well, why wait? They're waiting for the clarity. But the rules, as you just described, the tiers will remain in place. The discussion right now is how the PAL licenses will be dealt with. So for the person that asked the question on 365 licenses, you can go acquire a 365 license today, be set up and use it, and when that converts, it converts to a GAA portion. You need the equipment that's going to make sure that it's compatible, which Telrad is. We've already done the tests with the SAS system, right? That's the database. But most importantly, I've heard of people going on eBay. 2 people got them. They bought them between $5,000 and $6,000. You can get them from other people. Telrad, of course, we've got a list of people, and occasionally people will come to us and say, I want to sell this license. So we've got people there. And then there's other people like Steve and others that may have others that say that they know contacts. But the key point is there is no reason to wait. Get deployed now, get your footprint out there, get in business, and then CBRS will only extend in the PAL area to additional spectrum. So there's no reason to wait. Steve, did anything I said that was out of bounds?
No, I would just say this, that we expect that the general authorized access tier will be open, hopefully by the end of this year. What is ongoing now is the certification of equipment process and the spectrum access system at the FCC, and a lot of folks in the private sector that are working collaboratively to make that all happen. So 365 now, open up into CBRS GAA by hopefully the end of this year, and then acquire auction spectrum in a couple of years. But until that time, we're going to go from 50 to 150 megahertz pretty quickly. So I think that's a good way to answer your question. So the answer is yes.
Yep. Thank you. Nick, anything that you want to add?
Nothing for me, thanks.
Okay, very good. All right, so moving on, and I've been covering this very quickly so that we could have that lengthened discussion, so I'm sorry. One of the questions that gets asked a lot of times is people think that that the price of spectrum will kill their business case. And Dory, I think I went a slide or two too far. We're going to do our next poll, and I think one of them is the topic of spectrum.
Sure, let me launch that right now.
Thank you.
So what is holding you back from making the move to fixed LTE? You're not sure that there's a business case, acquiring spectrum will kill my business case, don't know which vendor to choose, or not sure what value fixed LTE brings to my business.
Great, so would love to get as much input on this as possible, so please vote. We've got about 30% of you that voted so far, so thank you very much, really appreciate it. We learn a lot from what people poll and what questions they ask. So we're at 40% voted. Do we give it another 10 seconds and then we'll close her down. %47 voted.
All righty, I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll now.
Yay, 50%, thank you.
So we've got not sure there's a business case at 44%, acquiring spectrum will kill my business case at 13%, don't know which vendor to choose 19%, and not sure what value fixed LTE brings to my business at 25%.
Okay, great. So we'll talk about these as we go forward. My point on the slide that you see here is that when people ask me about how to value spectrum, this is an example from a consulting firm named Wireless 2020. It's a very conservative estimate. In the top left and circled in purple, you see 2.5 gigahertz. And you see, and for those of you that have looked into spectrum, you know you pay it on a dollar per megahertz pop, and pop is population. And so we won't worry about the population now, because of that is a variable that either adds to your cost or decreases the cost. But let's look at it just from a dollar per megahertz. Mobile, it's about $1. But in fixed, it's 35 cents. Then if you look at, well, what do we think a PAL license would go for in a competitive environment? And the number they came up with was 30 cents. And you look at it and you say the 30 cents is awfully close to the 35 cents. Why is that? Why aren't they the same? Well, 2.5 is going to give you a little better performance than the 3.5 space will. So the value of a 2.5 license would be slightly higher. Having said that, we have talked to operators who have gotten pricing depending on the area they're in, where there was not a lot of competition and people weren't going to use it. They got it in the teens, right? So 19, 20 cents per megahertz pop. So it can vary. This is just a guideline. If you want to reduce the risk, and everything that Steve had covered, excuse me, everything that Steve covered in terms of what the possibilities are, again, I focus on the tunable radio. So 300 megahertz, we can cover a lot of what Steve talked about here, going from 3.5 all the way up to 3.8, or even going below 3.5 and covering it up. So in other words, it's tunable, right? That we would tune the radio for that 300 megahertz of spectrum that you would be using, but you've got a radio that's going to work for you. The carrier aggregation, here's a picture of it when we talked about concatenating two different channels. So here, the example would be two 10 megahertz carriers at the opposite ends of the band. So we concatenate those and make them look like one, which gives you higher throughput. So now let's talk about why fixed LTE in the business case. So this is baseline metrics that were provided to through a research that the WISPA Association did, and they polled a large number of operators to find out what the standards look like. So from an ARPU standpoint, 70% of people were getting $40 a month ARPU or greater. If you look at the next line, 23% of the operators were getting between $50 and $60, and 27% were getting over $60 per month in terms of ARPU. Now, those are great numbers, but what's even more impressive is if you look at churn, churn is minimal, and most of them, 67%, had churn rates of less than 1%. So it's not only that you're getting good ARPU, your churn is very low. The next bullet I want to bring your attention to is the growth. So 57% of respondents reported they're getting better than 11% per year growth, which is fantastic. So those are just some baseline metrics. If you've not been in the business and you're serving an area that's unserved and you're the only game in town, that's pretty much what it's going to look like. And I imagine some of the lower numbers were people that in a more competitive area, like the $40 a month. Now, 10 reasons why LTE makes sense for fixed. Two areas, business generation and business protection. So the one thing about LTE is because it uses OFDMA, it's a non-line of sight technology. Non-line of sight means you're able to work it in tree areas or obstructions. And what it means to you from a business standpoint is more share per tower, which effectively reduces your cost per sub. Number two, given that LTE is using a licensed or managed band, your ability to offer service level agreements and sleep at night is much better. The third is the exit strategy value. If you're using a standards-based technology, when they're doing the due diligence, you'll at least get a residual value for LTE because it's standards-based. You don't get that from my discussions with people in the financing business. They value that at zero. It's all about the customers that you have. So the residual value is better. In talking to telcos, wireline telcos that are in the tier 3 rural areas, as they look to buy WISPs, there's more value because they're going to be much more confident in a standards-based solution as well. Loans are easier to come by. One of our customers said, you know, it was hard getting loans before, but when they walk in, said we're using LTE, the same that's on your phone. People could understand that from an investment standpoint, and so they were much more comfortable loaning. Moving down to business protection. LTE that we use is the exact same LTE that's being driven by mobile operators and the specifications and standards. So all the capacity the mobile operator needs, which is immense because in a mobile environment, you don't get the bits per hertz that you otherwise would. Your capacity roadmap is being driven. So you're looking at things that you can accurately predict what tools will be available to me in the future. Second is that as a standard, just like with Wi-Fi, you get a lot more choice in terms of your manufacturers. If one manufacturer is going down a path that you don't see working for your business, you now have choice that you can select a different vendor. Obviously, carrier grade reliability and performance as you look to scale, or those of you that are operating bigger networks, very important. CPE options in manufacturers, so it's not just from a base station standpoint, but having the ability to buy a CPE that may work for you. It may be something that's specialized or special application. Those are now much more accessible. And then the last thing that's very important, and Nick and I talk about this, it's the talent pool. LTE, being a non-line of sight technology, is different to work with because it operates differently, because it uses things like reflections. And so the talent pool out there from the mobile industry means that engineers and people that understand it are in large numbers. So there's a lot more education than you would find if you, say, had a proprietary product. Okay, so the ecosystem here, I think we covered most of these things. When we talk about the second bullet there with the capacity rule of thumb at 5.5 bits per hertz. And then if you look at what LTE does with channels and how we get capacity and the different tools, you have to contrast that with non-LTE solutions that may offer high capacity, but they may be relying on huge chunks of spectrum. And as Nick describes it to me, when you have a larger chunk of spectrum, the noise floor and interference are cumulative. They add up, and you actually, it is much more of a challenge to increase capacity in that network, in that situation. I'm gonna move on for the sake of time. So LTE does deploy differently because, as I said, the non-line of sight. And if you look at LTE, to make use of the reflections, the standard basic initial setup for any LTE system is 2 antennas. So you can't buy a 1 antenna LTE system. They start with 2 or 4. You hear them up at 8 by 8 and so on. So these are the things that on a fundamental level, as you look at what's going to be required to deploy LTE, your engineers would need to go to one of our training classes, go to one of our webinars on the technical side, to make sure that you get out of the gate with a very good experience and not a lot of frustration. Now, what about 5G? If I talk to a lot of different prospects, they'll say, well, should I wait for 5G? From a standards perspective, 5G is on the same path that LTE is on, and 3G was on, and 2G was on. So 2G rolled to 3G, 3G rolled to 4G, 4G rolls to 5G. Now, there's things that happen in parallel, but if you look at the right-hand side, where you're talking about LTE and the releases that are being done, standardized, the timing, you go from LTE up to 5G. The one on the left was just a way to make it a little bit easier to understand what those releases are, release 10, 11, 12, etc. So as they roll forward, they're backward compatible for all intents and purposes. And the red line there is the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Association that used to be called the CCITT. So that is a telecommunications organization that adopts the wireless organization's rules and methods. From the value of what LTE brings, if you're looking at increasing the market share per tower, LTE as a tool gives you the non-line of sight capability and also the continuing capacity roadmap. So when we talk to our customers, a lot of people that have used unlicensed products, they tell us that it's about 3 years turn of equipment on the tower. So they're going to rip and replace in 3 years. With LTE and our products, we're able to make that more of a 6-year. I had one customer tell us they were going to keep it up there for 8 years. Of course, all of that is driven by the number of subs you have per sector and the consumption that you're undergoing. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but we do have the capacity means, the software tools to increase capacity, keep your time on the tower longer. And basically what that means, it's extending the life of your deployed assets, which means you can use capital and deploy it in new areas instead of having to replace what you already have every 3 years. The next component is offering higher value services. So one of the things that LTE has is that it's a layer 3 technology. It's not a layer 2 technology. So Telrad has developed all the layer 2 features and functions to be able to provide businesses the different types of things that they want when they want to do local networks or have multiple buildings, and the things that you'll want to serve that business customer. So we've built that from the ground up. So why Telrad for LTE? Very simply,
can I put in a question here?
Yes.
Would the existing equipment work with 5G, or do we have to replace the 4G equipment?
So you're looking at platforms, and so an existing platform isn't going to go backwards. It would be a new platform to support 5G. And so just spending a minute on 5G, because it can be a confusing topic. We hear about people in the frequencies using 29 gigahertz or 38 gigahertz. You're looking at people talking about a spectrum and saying it's 5G. People have talked about CBRS and saying it's a 5G band. It's simply a new band that 5G would be able to make use of. But 5G itself, for the lower latency, for the increased capacity, and the types of things require a new radio, and that new radio won't even be done, right? The standards are just now being finalized, which means you'll actually get first products that are final products in late 2019 or 2020. This came out of a presentation I saw given by Nokia just a week or so ago. So great question, but you want to make sure that you understand you're capitalizing on it, but it's a platform change at some point in the future. 2020 and the mobile market being the soonest. Nick, anything to add there?
I'll just state that 5G is a very wide umbrella, as you alluded to, Tom. So in general, functional splitting within the stack is a common feature of 5G. So you'll see complementary products such as 4G encompassed in a 5G solution. So the potential to leverage this existing hardware, but in a different way, is such that it is functionally split, and maybe a layer of control is brought to an aggregation point external to the box, meaning that the base station, the PHY, the MAC, could still be leveraged within a dual link 5G solution. But again, there will be additional infrastructure included in that migration as well.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, a few other questions have popped up since. Okay, would it be released at free band?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Would it be released at free band?
Free, F-R-E-E?
Correct.
Nick, I don't
quite understand the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Okay, maybe write a follow-up on that, Ahmed. Okay. Does this or any of your products support C-RAN configuration?
We currently do not. A C-RAN configuration is typically done or being looked at for very dense urban areas where rooftop is extremely expensive, rental's expensive, and what you want to do is you're trying to leverage your investment, like baseband units, all into hoteling or into a centralized RAN where you can do virtualization. As we talk about virtualization, the RAN is the last thing to be done. So C-RAN has been talked about a long time. You do see some successful deployments. Those typically happen in areas where the government and the operator work very closely together. And the key component you have to have is you have to have fiber front haul to go from that baseband hotel in C-RAN all the way out. So will they design that into 5G? Yes, it's an architecture. It's not something that they'll do different in 5G from a radio perspective, but it's more of a deployment architecture, and then it depends on your business case.
Okay, what are the expected spectrum for 5G at Telrad?
So we follow the standards. And so what we'll look at is what are those frequencies that are mobile, and then what do we have access to that makes sense from a fixed standpoint, that is enough spectrum for us to at the right price for our operators, because it's driven by all of you. And so we'll stick to bands where we have enough spectrum to provide the capacity, and it's part of the standards.
And that follow-up question for free would just, they meant unlicensed bands. So will it be released in unlicensed bands?
You know, I haven't looked at it. Nick, do you know if they're going to have it work in at 5 gig? I would.
Well, we have a 5 gig platform that will be introduced in late 2018.
Yeah,
if that's
okay.
the question.
Well, the question was 5G working in 5 gigahertz, but
yeah, expect that all the sub-6 bands that you see within 4G, 4.5G will ultimately evolve as part of 5G standard. But this is something that will happen progressively over time.
Yep. So they'll reuse the spectrum just like they do with 2G and 3G. So it rolls over to LTE today. So the with a couple of minutes remaining, very important point: a Wi-Fi system is a layer 2 device. So you can use a laptop, see the end user devices, and people operate that way today. What is oftentimes a surprise to people is LTE is a layer 3 device. It's integrated down to the handset. And so what Telrad had to do is write all of the software to enable the features that business customers are going to need. And here, if you look at bullet 3, 3GPP does not truly define static IP, right? That's not something that a mobile environment's going to use. So if you look at what we've done, we've written all of the software. So you're not making just a radio choice, you're making a network choice, so that you've got the tools to serve the customers that you want to reach. And in addition to this, it's just not the features and the functions, but it's also when you get to the network management and what we call our piece of software called CPE view, which allows us to get the information happening at each CPE level in the network so that you can manage it effectively without having to do a truck roll. So those are what I call the leaky bucket types of things. People make their purchase decision based on a radio, and then they get hung up in operational costs that drain the bank because they don't understand they didn't have layer 2 functionality. They didn't have things like CPE view or network management tools to effectively manage, and they end up having to roll a truck. Some of the operators that we have, gives you a smattering. The successful operators, they're scaling, they're growing, they're all still in business, and our list continues. So if you're serious about it, we can oftentimes set up a discussion with one of our operators to help you with peace of mind. The last and one of the most important, and I'll stop after this, even though we've got a couple other slides, you'll see them when they're released. But if you look at the top row of deployment options versus the bottom row, the top row is about getting to market cost effectively. So we can help you in low density deployments still be cost effective. We can help you with that dual sector function, which is if you look at 2 and 3, there are ways to effectively use a radio in a low density market, or one where you just want to provide coverage to certain locations to test the market. The bottom half really talks about, hey, I need a tool with maximum non-line of sight penetration because that's the environment I'm in. Perhaps Wisconsin would be a good example of that. Number 5 is really, I need to get a maximum peak rate. So we have ways and tools of doing that. You'll see carrier aggregation written there. And then the last is, hey, I need to get the most out of my spectrum because I only have so much spectrum. I can't get more, or I don't perceive I'll be able to get access to more. And so that's where spectral efficiency comes in. So this is why we say with a Telrad solution, we've got flexibility, and all of these solutions that you see here, you have one radio on the truck. So one radio does all of these things, not simultaneously, obviously, but it can be deployed in any of these scenarios. So I'm happy to present the rest of it, but Dory, I'm going to stop, see if there's any questions from people, And if anyone hangs around, I'll cover the last couple. I'll watch the attendee numbers here.
I don't currently have any questions pending.
Okay. So for those of you that are going to move on, thank you. For those of you that are willing to stay, this slide here talks about our comprehensive solution. In the upper right-hand corner, that's the network management and performance management tool that I talked about. And that's very critical to cost-effective operations of your network, which is oftentimes sadly forgotten. Right below it is the UE or CPE management, CPE view. Again, our customers really needed this, and so we developed it from scratch to give them the tools to understand what's happening at that CPE at any point in time. Obviously, as you move to the middle, to the left of the CPE management, you see 3 different options for deploying the EPC, the Evolved Packet Core. The Evolved Packet Core is your gateway that gets you out to the internet. The SGW is the signaling component. And then down below, you'll see the other components that involve getting AAA, so your authentication, or getting to being able to do billing. So our methods here are to be able to slice up the EPC, make sure that it doesn't become an inhibitor to financial success for you. And what we do is we actually put an EPC in the radio, so it's integrated all in one. Or you can have a centralized EPC, and you could actually do those geo-redundant. So if you're looking for flexibility in the EPC, we have it, we've tested it, we've used it, and it's central to the operations of an LTE network. On the left-hand side, you see 3 radios with antennas on them, and then that's the different CPE portfolio. If you're a WiMAX customer and you're looking for a graceful way to go from WiMAX to LTE, you would use the 7000 CPE 7000 product. The 8000 and 9000 have different advantages each one. The 9000 brings in carrier aggregation, so it costs a little bit more money, but it gives you that future-proofing aspect of it. So that covers the overall solution. And of course, there's a lot of good questions that I'm sure you'll want to ask as you dig in deeply. Our sales guys are great at being able to do that. The why Telrad? We have more experience than anyone else. One of the highest compliments ever paid to me at a trade show was someone that said, yep, everybody has their problems. I've been in the business for 20 years. Everyone eventually hits some problem. It's how they take care of the problem. And Telrad actually doesn't stop until we help get that customer up and running. So that was a tremendous benefit to hear. You look at if you're an unlicensed operator today and you've been buying radios on a per radio price basis, the thinking has to change when you were working with LTE and non-line of sight. You have to look at it from a return on investment standpoint, because the radio stays on the tower 6 years. It has the capacity upgrades. It has all these things. So we can help you with that financial modeling, because it really is about the return on investment and not the initial radio price. And then, we talked about the layer 2 features and the CPE view and things like that. So we've got the portfolio that you need to win in the majority of situations out there. How to get started? So Dory, we've got some people still here. Do you want to ask the final poll?
Absolutely. So let me launch the final poll. This one is just about whether you're interested in a trial kit. This will make it a lot easier for our folks to be able to get in touch with you and give you information, pricing, timing for if you are interested in getting one. So please go ahead. The options are yes, please contact me to arrange. I still have questions regarding the technology, or I'm not ready.
Okay, great. This is good. 63% have voted. Awesome. And the people that still have questions regarding the technology, the slide that I've got up there should be helpful. And to the people that are not ready, I would love to hear from you on why you're not ready, right? What is it? Where are you? What are you thinking? How can we help? My email is tom.gruba, G-R-U-B-A, tom.gruba@telrad.com. And on the screen, you'll see Mike Cook, who is our VP of North America Sales. Any questions, issues, comments, we'd love to hear them. We've also got new channel partners. Wave and Tesco are the latest additions. you can spend a day with us at one of our road shows or an industry event. If you want to see where we're going, Dory always has that on the homepage website. You can buy a starter kit. That gets you up and running, and Nick and his team make sure, because they provide a certain level of support with each starter kit that goes out, to make sure that you have a good experience. You can also take the Telrad training. So that gives you 3 days of an in-depth understanding of LTE, and in particular, our LTE. And then, of course, like I said before, talking with other successful Telrad customers is certainly an option for you. I think this is a final slide, or at least we'll make it so. It's where to find us. The previous webinars, Dory puts all of them on YouTube, so we send out a note, so you'll see that. You can cover this in detail if you want. We're going to be doing hosted webinars through NTCA, so tell all your friends. We'll continue to do these that are Telrad specific, but we'll also be starting to do some with NTCA. And I'm always interested to understand, what didn't we cover that you'd like to hear about? Do we start adding other webinars than other topics? Send us your ideas. And then the next shows we've got coming up, you'll see here at the bottom, we just got through IP Vision in New Orleans. I was on that panel. It went very well. NTCA regional shows in July and August, and then, of course, Whisperpalooza in Las Vegas, October 8th or 12th. And our sales teams are always working out in the markets in each of the states. And we work with different people like Power Intel and others to support them at shows, and to make sure that we can answer questions for customers. So I really want to thank everyone for staying. I know you've stayed long, and it's a long presentation, but really appreciate you being here. I want to thank Steve Cran very much for being on and helping answering those questions, as well as Nick and Dory, who always do a fabulous job of taking care of me on the webinar here.
Yes, thanks to everyone for being here today. We really appreciate it.